Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the Western political and media establishment has repeatedly claimed that this was an entirely unprovoked invasion, and more specifically that it had nothing to do with NATO expansion. Now, anyone who knows a bit of history knows this claim to be untenable, if anything because Russian officials had been raising increasingly vocal concerns about the issue for several years prior to 2022. So it's a historical fact that Russia viewed NATO's encroachment upon its borders, and especially the prospect of Ukraine joining NATO, even if just de facto, if not formally, as a threat to its national security. However, thanks to numerous confidential US diplomatic cables published by WikiLeaks, we also know that US officials were perfectly aware of this, and indeed on several occasions, from the early 2000s in particular all the way up to Russia's invasion, in 2022, US diplomats warned the political leadership in Washington that Russia viewed NATO expansion as a threat and as a provocation, and one that could ultimately even lead to war. A September 2005 cable, for example, stated that the former French presidential diplomatic advisor warned, and I quote, that the question of Ukrainian accession to NATO remained extremely sensitive for Moscow, and concluded that if there remained one potential cause for war in Europe, that was Ukraine. Another cable from 2007 spoke about Putin complaining to another French diplomat about the anti-Russian nature of NATO enlargement, and we have several other cables recording the concerns of other countries such as Germany and Italy about, and I quote, provoking Russia by raising the prospect of Ukraine and Georgia joining NATO. Particularly telling are the numerous cables sent to Washington by the then US ambassador to Russia, William Burns, who is now the director of the CIA. On several occasions, Burns conveyed the consensus among regional and US experts that worsening US-Russia relations and growing Russia-China ties were largely the byproduct of bad US policies. First and foremost, the US disregard for Russian concerns about NATO enlargement. Another cable sent by Burns in March 2008 stated that opposition to NATO's eastward expansion was one of the few security areas where there is almost complete consensus among Russian policymakers. In perhaps Burns' most famous cable, sent after the 2008 NATO summit in Bucharest, in which NATO announced that it intended to admit Ukraine and Georgia as members, Burns described his meeting with the Russian foreign minister, noting that Moscow considered the entry of Ukraine and Georgia into NATO an absolute red line. The cable was titled "Niet means Niet," no means no. But we also know from several cables that US officials in Washington systematically dismissed and disregarded these concerns, which, as we have seen, were being conveyed not only by Russian officials, but also by several Western diplomats and experts. On one occasion, they even accused Norway, which had spoken about the need to understand Russia's concerns, of parroting Russia's line. And this is essentially the line that US administrations have stuck to in subsequent years, while they proceeded to de facto integrate Ukraine into NATO structures all the way up to Russia's invasion in 2022. And indeed, it's the line they've stuck to ever since, by claiming that the invasion was completely unprovoked. And yet, thanks to the cables made available by WikiLeaks, we know that this claim is completely false. The US and NATO were fully aware that they were provoking Russia, and yet, out of hubris, or even worse, because they were hoping for this outcome, they continued on the same course. And we know this thanks to WikiLeaks, and this is a reminder of the crucial public interest service provided by WikiLeaks in exposing the true machinations of those in power. The ruling classes aren't content with just controlling the present, they also want to control and rewrite the past. Assange sacrificed his freedom for all of us, and the least we can do is use the freedoms we have left to help him regain his freedom.